Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Guardian Live event. For those of you that do use Twitter, we'd love to hear from you during and after the show. Please use hashtag Guardian Live, but do keep your phones on silent. Now please put your hands together and give a very warm welcome to your host, Anushka Asthana.
Good evening. Who knew? 4 politicians blathering on about Britain's place in the EU, and we sold out the London Palladium. Welcome, here we are. Now, we were going to have this debate in a much smaller venue, but tickets sold so fast that we had to move here, from Westminster to the West End, which kind of feels appropriate. I mean, this referendum is getting all quite dramatic. Today, the Prime Minister accused Boris of making it up as he went along. Then there's Project Fear, heard of that? Or is it Project Fact? Today I heard Project Fantasy. And to be honest, I'm wondering if Project Confused is more appropriate. Let's see, hands up, who's still not sure how they might vote? Well, you've got 100 days to decide. And this is high-stakes stuff. In just under 4 months, Britain could start the process of pulling out of the European Union. And as you might have guessed, passions are running high on both sides of this debate. Well, tonight we have a stellar cast for you. 4 people with pretty different opinions, ready to slug it out. Apologies that we were a bit late. 3 of them were voting in the so-called Snoopers Charter Bill. Now, we're in a theatre, but as you just heard, let's have phones on. I want them on silent, but we want you all to have your say through Twitter. I'll try and keep up with the comments through the night. Now, enough of me. Let me introduce our panel for tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together.
You can go there.
So, let me tell you who we've got. Alan Johnson, who I would call a Labour... They agree? A Labour big beast, leading the party's campaign to remain. Nick Clegg, former Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you.
And a self-confessed Europhile, Andrea Leadsom, the Conservative Energy Minister. She's taking on her own leader, David Cameron, to campaign for out. And Nigel Farage, the UKIP leader. A man who clearly divides opinion, a man on a Brexit mission. Welcome to you all. Now, just to let you know how this is going to work, we're going to have questions that have been put in advance from the audience. There are some questions from our readers on Guardian Witness, which is dedicated to citizen journalism, and then from me. And in fact, I would like to go first. So here's a question to all of you. Why are you trying to scare British voters? Nigel.
I'm not. I want to inspire them. I want to tell them that this country, for 1,000 years, ran itself rather successfully and rather well. And whilst I love Europe, I want to trade with Europe, cooperate with Europe, be friends with our neighbours. I think we can do a damn sight better making our own laws in our own parliament, controlling our own borders, and reaching out to the rest of the world. I don't want to scare anybody. I want to inspire you that we're better than being a star on somebody else's flag.
Okay, so Alan, Nigel says he's being positive. Why Project Fear?
Well, Nigel's positive about everything, pessimistic about everything until it comes to Britain leaving Europe. And then he turns into Anne of Green Gables and says everything will be fabulous and wonderful. We live in an increasingly dependent world. I think I'm the only one old enough, sadly, to have voted in 1975. I voted yes, and I'm pleased I did, and I think in the ensuing 41 years, Europe has not only been important for our prosperity and our security, but it's helped to ensure that countries that were under totalitarian rule in the East and under military dictatorship in the South of Europe have gone from oligarchy to democracy. I think that's far more important and inspiring than anything that I've heard Nigel or UKIP say.
All right, you're all inspiring us tonight, but come on, Nick. There's been There's been plenty of warnings about job losses, about the economy. You're not scaring people?
Oh, sorry, right. No, it's not a question of fear, but I think it's legitimate to be concerned about what this means, not just for us and for those of us here, but for our kids and for future generations. Because this is one of those unusual votes. General election votes, other, democratic contests, they can go one way and then go the other way next. This is a decision which will cast a very long shadow, one way or the other, for the people who don't have a vote, for next generation. When I think of my kids, I've got 14-year-old, 11-year-old, 7-year-old. I think to myself, this is obviously what I believe, if we pull out of the European Union, we will, I think, almost certainly then see the United Kingdom fall apart. So it's not just one union, it's two unions that are at stake. I think we'll be less relevant in the world. We'll be sort of drifting friendlessly somewhere south of Greenland. And then what? And it's just not the kind of country I want my kids to grow up in. It's as simple as that.
Another man who divides opinion. Let's hear from a woman. Andrea.
Thanks, Anushka. The EU has changed beyond all recognition. It used to be a free trade area. Now it's trying to take over everything. This is the single opportunity, it's the best chance we have to make it on our own. This is a brilliant country, the 5th biggest economy in the world. We have so much creativity. We speak English. We're in the time zones between North America and Asia. We have absolutely every opportunity to make the best of it if we go alone. We've got to stop letting the EU rule things. We've got to take control, save lots of money, and do our own thing.
All right, thank you all very much. I'm gonna have to keep my eye on those hecklers out there. You're gonna have to pipe down, I've been told. Right, can we take a question from the audience? We've got Lionel Derry. Where's Lionel? There you go.
Specifically, procedurally and economically, if Britain leaves the EU, what would happen? And if we don't know the answer to that, I don't know how anybody can vote for a Brexit. But specifically, what is going to happen if Britain leaves?
Well, Andrea, maybe you could go first. Your Prime Minister, your party leader, says that we could enter a period of uncertainty. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think the point is that if we decide to leave the EU, we will then be in a position to negotiate the terms that we want. Let's face it, the EU exports more to the UK than we do to the EU. It's in all of our interests for friendly cooperation. That's what's going to happen. Nobody has a crystal ball. I don't, do you? And so the point is, we will have to negotiate the terms of trade, but those terms of trade will be there. And the key issue is we will be back in the driving seat, able to determine the terms of trade, not just with the EU, but with the rest of the world.
But what happens in that period?
Well, very specifically, there's at least 2 years before any of the treaties are disapplied, and that's assuming that you straight away on day 2 invoke Article 50 of the Treaty of Rome, which you don't have to do. When Greenland left the EU, they did not do that. It didn't even exist when they left the EU. So it's perfectly possible to negotiate a terms of exit with continuity and then the potential of leaving.
Alan doesn't agree. What are you saying?
I think that means we spend time and treasure trying to get back to the very good trade deals we've got at the moment, negotiating trade deals with 53 different countries, trying to retain what we've already got by our trade deal with the biggest commercial market in the world, bigger than China, bigger than the US. At the same time, we've got to deal with the question of immigration. People think we would be better in terms of, for people who are obsessed with immigration, we'd be better. We'd lose the protection of the Dublin Accord. We would lose, in all probability, that deal we've got with France at our most vulnerable point. And I believe that most of the exit groups, there's different versions of them, and there's a multitude of different leave groups. A large majority of them want free movement anyway. So those thinking they're going to get rid of free movement, if it's Norway, that is their example, we still have free movement. If it's Switzerland, we still have free movement. If it's any kind of trade deal that means anything with the rest of the European Union, it still means free movement.
Well, let's put that to Nigel. It's still free movement, Nigel.
Alan, you can speak for your side of the debate. Please do not attempt to speak for our side of the debate. There is nobody...
Which side?
There is nobody
Which of the 5
supporting
sides?
Brexit that does not want this country to return to sanity, which means border controls and an Australian-style point system to decide who comes to Britain. We don't want unconditional free movement of people. Now, Lionel asked the question, what will happen legally, procedurally, after this referendum? If we vote to remain, I can't answer the question because I have absolutely no idea just how much legislation is in the pipeline and will come on to British businesses, will affect our ability to be competitive. I can tell you that within a few years, if we vote to remain, we're voting to go into a political union with Turkey, 77 million even poorer people, which won't just mean even less control over our borders and even more people coming, but our borders going to Iraq, Iran and Syria, raising some very, very big questions.
Okay, there's some
Now-
heckling.
Now, you asked-
Nigel, Nick wants to cut in
if
there.
we vote to leave,
Here we go.
what will happen? We'll invoke, as Angela said, Article 50 of the treaty and enter into a negotiation period that will last up to 2 years. I very much hope it'll be shorter than that. But the absolute key point here is this. What we're doing if we vote to leave is we're voting to become an independent, self-governing nation that makes its own laws, does its own deals, and charts its own course. And already tonight, you've seen Alan talking about the impossibility of doing deals, and Nick basically implying that we be some piddling little island just south of Greenland. The other side think we must be part of this European Union because they don't think we're good enough to govern
right.
our own country
Thank you very
and to
much.
make our own laws. And I do.
Nigel,
I do.
as much as I do love you to carry on, remember who's the boss here. Nick.
No, when Lionel, is it? When Lionel asked the question, I thought we were finally going to hear from Nigel and Andrea so it's no point just saying 2 years and negotiations. What specifically, that was the question, what specifically happens at the end of that negotiation? What country?
free trade deal
hang on,
and
but what?
control of our
Sometimes
economy.
I hear people who want to leave the European Union say we'll be like Norway.
No, you don't.
Some
No, you
say
don't.
Iceland.
No, you don't.
Well, hang on,
No,
let me
you
finish the
don't.
list.
Nick.
Let me finish
You
the
don't.
list.
Oh, no,
Some
you
say
don't.
Switzerland. Some say Andorra.
No, you
Boris
don't
Johnson
hear that.
says Canada, and Andrea's just said Greenland.
No,
You just said Greenland. So
absolutely
Greenland was the
did
only
not
one that.
say we are like Greenland.
Let me
Don't
finish.
put words
Let me
in my
finish.
mouth, Nick.
The point is about all of those countries that are outside of the European Union that try to trade into the European Union. All of them, without exception, have considerably worse terms of trade with our European neighbours than we do by being part of, let's remember, what is the world's largest marketplace. And Andrea
No, it's not.
just repeated one of the great myths in this debate, that we export more to them than they do to us. This is simply not true. 50% of what we export goes to the European Union. The total exports from the rest of the European Union to us is about 10% of their total exports.
Okay.
So who has the whip
Nick,
hand?
let's,
Who has the whip hand?
No,
I'm
that's not
sorry.
correct.
Nigel, Andrea's going to
you know.
come back in here. I'm going to ask Andrea to respond on this point. What Nick is saying there is that the trade deals that exist with other countries that are not part of a customs union are inferior. A lot of people talk about Canada. There are tariffs on a lot of goods. How do you respond to that?
Well, for a start, it's a load of nonsense that it's Iceland or Norway. Iceland has 300,000 population. Switzerland has 8 million population. Those are small countries
You
compared to
raised
the UK.
Greenland, I didn't.
We are the 5th largest economy in the world. We, of course, can survive on our own 2 feet. How many free trade agreements has the EU managed to negotiate? A pitiful number. They haven't even managed to negotiate one with the United States. The UK, on its own, would be far more able to negotiate for free trade in the services area, which is what matters so much to our economy. In the EU, intra-EU trade in services is absolutely abysmal. It's all about goods, and that's not where our economy is
Forgive me,
strongest. And a free trade agreement will be perfectly possible, and you know it.
Okay,
Well,
one
can
sec.
I just-
I'm going
just
to...
one fact.
Can I?
Just
No,
one
I
small
mean-
fact.
That big, and then I'm
Yeah.
going to bring in Georgia from the
No,
audience.
just one factual observation. A long time ago, before I went into politics, those halcyon, untroubled days, I worked as a EU trade negotiator, for instance, helping I was a small cog in a bigger wheel, but helping to try
Yes,
and settle the terms of China's accession to the World Trade Organization and Russia's accession into the World Trade Organization. I remember sitting as part of that negotiating team on the other side of the table of a line of pretty flinty-faced Chinese trade negotiators. They listened to what we had to say because we represented 500 million people. Do you seriously think we can strike a better trade deal with a superpower like China representing 60 million as opposed to 500 million?
Yes,
it makes no sense.
Yes, no, Nick, we do.
Hold that point.
Nick,
We're going to bring in Georgia.
No, I'm sorry.
We are going to bring in Georgia from the audience.
I'm sorry.
Georgia,
Nick,
where are you?
No, I can't let that go.
No.
I know it's
Come on,
past the
Georgia.
pantomime
You
season.
need to cut in on Nigel.
But, oh no, you don't. Nick, you talked about doing a trade deal with China. Iceland has a population of 1/3 They've done a trade deal with China, and the European Union hasn't managed to do it. If Iceland's big enough, we're big enough.
Thank you very much.
Bad deal.
Where's Georgia? There you are. Okay, let's hear from Georgia.
What will the European Union be in 10 years' time if we stay in or leave?
Thank you very much. Let's start with you, Alan.
Well, whatever it is, we'd have had a say in what it is. And the argument that Nigel just used about Turkey, Turkey can only come into the European Union if there is a unanimous decision by the members of the European Union. We have a veto over countries that might join. We are an influential country.
Are you seriously saying that Britain's position now is to block Turkey's accession?
I'm saying that we have a say in it. I'm saying that if we're outside the European Union, we're still affected by what happens on our continent, including what's happening just across the channel in France. We have a say in what happens in Europe over the next 10 years. And I reject this argument that Europe is always something that's done to us. That where Britain is the six-stone weakling on the beach, having sand kicked in our face by these bullying continentals. It is a ridiculous parody of how Europe operates. So I want to see us in Europe. I want to see us effective in Europe. I want to see us influential in Europe, as we have been for 41 years.
Okay. Nigel, is what you're saying a ridiculous parody, and where will the EU be in 10 years?
We're influential in Europe, all right. We're very influential. In fact, since 2010, and for most of that time, Nick here was the Deputy Prime Minister, since 2010, there have been 40 occasions on which, at the Council of Ministers, we have said this piece of legislation is against the interests of the United Kingdom, and we please ask you to change this law. And do you know what? We've lost on 40 occasions. That's how influential we are as members of the European Union.
It's rubbish.
Now,
that's just rubbish.
Nobody can tell exactly in 10 years' time where anything will be. I would just say this, that whatever the ideas were post-war of getting France and Germany together to reconcile after the disasters that had happened, that all made sense. Breaking down trade barriers made sense. The more people trade with each other, the friendlier they are with each other. But the project now has completely outlived its purpose. It now looks 40 years out of date. It has a currency that has brought poverty to tens of millions in the Mediterranean. It has a migrant crisis. It has dealt so badly with the migrant crisis that it's stoking up all sorts of massive social problems. And right across Europe, we see people now not wanting the project as it is. If we stay on board this, in 10 years' time, we will stay part of a failing political project. If we leave, not only will we be better off, but I hope we'll inspire the rest of Europe to change the whole thing and get back to a club of friends who are sovereign nations that trade together.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I'd like to bring Andrea into this, but also let me just tell you, Andrea, what we've just had from Kate Brax on Twitter. Does anyone consider the little guys in this? Many farmers in the UK survive on EU subsidies, a whole industry down the pan.
Well,
you're a rural MP?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of farmers in my constituency. And what I can say about that is, net, we send £9 billion a year to the EU. Gross, it's 19 billion. And the remainder that we get back in subsidies are things we have to apply for, things we have to beg for, things we have to co-finance, pet projects of the EU. So farmers, yes, they are supplicants, asking for roughly 50% back of the money that they paid over in the first place. So my answer to that is on voting to leave the EU, the United Kingdom government will absolutely continue in the short term to provide those subsidies whilst we think about what makes sense. And some of the things that would make sense would be environmental trading credits, because at the moment you have farmers who have to do a bit of environmental planning and a bit of farming just to meet the EU requirements. It would make so much more sense if those with the big fields do the sheep and those with the hill farms do the butterflies. That would make a lot more sense for the UK. And it's perfectly possible, but only if we leave the EU and sort it out for ourselves.
We're talking about the longer future, and I'm going to just throw another one in there for you, Nick. If you could just wait. We're talking about the longer future from Georgia. We've also heard about Turkey a few times. One question that we had from Ms. Montoya was this. When the EU was originally formed, we were a group of countries with similar norms socially, culturally, morally, and judicially. As more entrants have joined, can we still say that all members have the same values or cultural norms? And how can we continue to say that we are part of a like-minded community with the imminent entry of Turkey, a country with a terrible human rights record and a dynamic growth population set to reach over 100 million? In 10 years, are Turkey part of the EU?
I doubt it, and I don't think there's no imminent entry of Turkey. But the point about that question is, actually, I think one of the unusual successes of the European Union is it has encompassed very different countries, yes, with different histories, economies, societies, cultures, and so on, in a sense sharing one particular economic space, but doing things differently. You know, we haven't become any less British since 1973. We're not part of Schengen. We're not part of the Eurozone. It isn't a straitjacket. It's a much more flexible arrangement than I think the question implies. But can I just very quickly, to the person who asked what in 10 years' time, look, my guess is three big things will have changed. Firstly, the European Union clearly, and particularly the rest of the European Union, the countries in the borderless Schengen area, will have to, and I hope rapidly, sort out the external border controls of Schengen. Because it made no sense to have a borderless arrangement where you've got no internal borders or external borders. So I think that's one thing that will have to happen, and I hope fast. Secondly, just because of the threat of cross-border crime, cross-border terrorism, we have a Brit who's the head of Europol. A lot of the things that we do in Europe help keep us safe. The European arrest warrant allowed us to extradite Hussein Osman, who was then convicted here in the United Kingdom, one of the people who tried to blow people up in London on the 21st of July 2005. I think that cooperation to keep our streets safe will deepen. And I think the Eurozone, which is clearly still in quite a sort of shaky state, will need to sort itself out, particularly by making sure that the stronger countries, Germany and so on, help out the weaker countries so you don't have these great imbalances. As for the UK, here's the only final observation I want to make. I hope we will be, in 10 years' time, a leading member of the European Union, not cowering on the side, not sort of trying to pull up the drawbridge and wish the rest of the world away, but actually leading in our own neck of the woods. But if we were to leave, here's the great thing which Nigel and Andrea never admit. They rant and rail about these rules. We would still have to abide by those rules if we wanted to continue to trade in the European Union. The difference is, like Norway and Switzerland, we would have to abide by the rules, but we couldn't write the rules. What's the control and power in that?
Okay, Andrea, pick up that point. But while you're there, let me just throw in another one from Twitter.
Can I just answer that?
One sec, let me just throw this in for you. Can you name one specific EU regulation that you consider to be harmful to the UK and why?
Okay, can I answer this question first? Because I think it's really important to bear in mind that we will, as the UK, in the end, have 12% of the voting in the European Union. 12%. As Nigel says, we've failed to ever persuade them, just using persuasion, to do anything for us. In fact, over the last 20 years, we've tried 70 times and failed 70 times to get legislation changed so that it meets the UK's interests. So the only vetoes we will have in the EU will be defence, so going to war, a bit of tax, and then accession of new member states. We won't be a member of Schengen, and we won't be a member of the Euro. And what we have to bear in mind is that those two things alone, the migration issues and the Eurozone issues, require that the EU move to political union. That's where it's going. If you look at quotes from Angela Merkel, from President Hollande, from Juncker, from Tusk, they all say the same thing. The EU is headed towards political union. Union. We simply can't stay a part of it. We have to do our own thing.
So, Andrea, you're not
and it's
convinced by the
simply
Prime
nonsense.
Minister's reforms, then?
I'm sorry?
You're not convinced by the Prime Minister's
Well,
reforms?
you know, I think actually the Prime Minister's reforms, he absolutely bust a gut. I mean, he looked exhausted, didn't he? He really tried very hard. He had the certainty of a referendum in the UK behind his reforms. And what was apparent is there is no appetite for reform. So he came back with something that's not enforceable, not legally binding, won't happen, and so reform is simply not possible. So actually, at every level, we have the opportunity, the sunlit uplands, Project Hope, every opportunity outside of the EU, and we should just take it.
So that
So
Twitter
give us
question.
that one example. Give us that one example. Give us the one example. Andrea, I was a Secretary of State in 5 different departments. I spent 11 years negotiating in Europe, and I don't recognise this picture of being overruled all the time. Give us one piece of legislation that's been imposed on us.
Okay, one example from when I was Treasury Minister is the fact that the European Union did not want the Bank of England to be able to impose higher capital requirements on UK banks. The Bank of England wanted to do that because the UK banking system is enormous. Their assets are 5 times UK GDP, so we wanted to reserve the right to have higher capital requirements for prudential reasons. The European Union didn't want us to do that because they wanted maximum harmonisation, so they felt it might give us somehow an unfair advantage. So that's clearly not in the UK interest, yet it was imposed upon us.
Okay, no, one sec. No, we're going to go to a question in a minute.
Another one? Wow. I can carry on all night
Right.
giving you examples.
We've had an anonymous question from the audience, which is going to be kindly read out by our volunteer page.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear it. I think you're just talking into my ear. All right.
Switch it on.
Not to worry. I'll do it. I'll do it for you.
How can the Labour Party claim to support the working class by voting to stay in when all evidence suggests that the uncontrolled immigration is suppressing wages, clogging up the NHS, creating a housing shortage, flooding the schools with more pupils than they can cope with, and finally give £20 billion per year into the EU instead of investing it here?
Yeah.
Alan, I think this one's for you.
Because I think so as well. Because we're an internationalist party, because we believe in solidarity, because we believe that countries working together in our continent can resolve problems that we couldn't possibly resolve alone. On the question of immigration, there are issues around exploitation and about fairness. We'd like to resolve those issues. For instance, there is a social dimension to Europe. Protection, basic protection for workers that I'm answering the question, that many of Andrea's compatriots, not Andrea herself perhaps, call red tape. That's protection with maternity leave, paternity leave, the right for part-timers
to get. You're asking
why representatives of working people would not want to divide those working people in the xenophobic way that many of the opponents of the EU are trying to do.
So Alan,
furthermore, those issues can be resolved. They weren't on David Cameron's agenda. There are trade unionists and socialist parties throughout Europe who want to stop the exploitation that some employers are using against Eastern Europeans that come to this country. We can do that through the European Union.
All right.
If we leave, we have no control over that, and I guarantee we would still have free movement of labour.
To Nick on those points. First of all, do you really believe that women's rights like maternity leave would go if Britain was on its own? And secondly, do you agree with Lord Rose, the chair of Stronger in Britain campaign, that wages would go up if we had Brexit?
Look, I obviously can't speak as a socialist, but I would say this, to whether you're from the left or the right or the centre or whatever.
You're in the centre, aren't you, Nick?
Well, no, whatever. I'm kind of in the middle, I think. Whatever political persuasion you are, here's the thing. I think actually you've got to go right back to sort of fundamentals. What kind of world do you think we live in? And how do you think Britain, or any British government, from right, left or centre, can play its role to keep people safe to get people in good jobs, to raise money through taxes to fund decent public services, to keep our air clean and the water that we drink clean as well? How do you do that for your own citizens? And well, this is the answer to the question.
I'll make sure he answers the question.
Hang on.
Don't worry.
I know the suspense is killing you. Just let me answer the question. I just don't think any British government of whatever persuasion can do that for us, for British citizens, unless you work with other countries, because you cannot. You cannot, in an era of globalization, sort out your economy unless you do it with others. You cannot keep your streets safe unless you work with others to beat cross-border crime. You cannot keep your environment clean unless you work with others. And that's why I think it's not just if you're a socialist, so I'm pointing at you, but not if you're just from the left. Wherever you're from, working together keeps us safer and stronger and fairer for the future.
Well, I think I can safely say that on this one, Andrea, you disagree with Nick?
I mean, it just defies belief that we survived until 1970, doesn't it? How on earth did we do that?
Why did we grow afterwards?
Well, we didn't, actually.
Why
We grew in line with global growth. We haven't grown particularly spectacularly. But can I just ask Alan this question? Who introduced shared parental leave? Something that's done so much for women in this country.
Yeah.
The coalition government, my point is, very happy for you to take credit for it.
Here we go again.
But it wasn't.
Here we go again.
The point
we did it. The Lib Dems did it.
The point is, it was not the European Union.
Yeah.
What we're talking about here is not your personal achievements, Nick. It's what the European Union can do. And it was a British government that introduced that. It's the most ridiculous argument to say that somehow equal pay, aspiration, women's rights, the issues for parental childcare and so on, these are British issues. They're not
you asked me a question.
European. Yeah, I'm asking you.
Here's
are you
the answer.
seriously saying that we would scrap them?
Here's the answer. Which party was it that opted Britain out of the social chapter and all the benefits? And number two, which party had in their 2010 manifesto that they should reduce maternity leave? The first was the Conservatives, the second was UKIP.
So,
Okay.
so
Which
can I,
party was it,
on that...
Okay, very quickly, Andrea, then I'll come to Nigel.
Very quickly, on the social chapter, in my constituency, in the run-up to the general election, talking to an HGV driver who is subject to the Agency Workers Directive, an EU measure that says if you're employed by an agency, then after 12 weeks you're entitled to contractual rights the same as if you're a permanent member of staff. What he wanted to know is why it can possibly be allowed that he gets laid off every week 11, so he then can't provide for his family. And of course the answer is so that they can start the clock ticking again, so they don't have to give him contractual rights. It's just ridiculous. Okay, it's an unintended consequence, but the UK on its own could solve it in a heartbeat. We can't as a part of the EU because they tell us what to do.
Okay, I'm going to go over to Nigel now.
No, let me have a say on this. Which party was it, Alan? Which party was it that in 2004 opened up the door to 8 and then 10 poor former communist countries, and in doing so depressed the wages of working class people in this country? In fact, in many ways, the Labour Party, through its new love affair with the European Union, has betrayed the very working classes it was supposed to represent.
Let me ask you a question, Nigel, that we've got here from Witness, Mal Pitt. If Leave wins, do current EU migrants get temporary work visas during or after transition and then have to apply to stay under some sort of point system? Or do they automatically become some flavour of UK citizen? You've talked a lot about Bulgarians and Romanians, Nigel. If we have Brexit, do you kick them out?
Well, of course, I did talk about Bulgaria and Romania, and I made some predictions for the numbers that would come, which, of course, were completely laughed at and denied by Nick and the others, and it proved that actually what I'd said was an underestimate of the numbers that would come. Whatever mistakes we've made in the past, and we've made some very big mistakes, although I'm not sure we know the scale of those mistakes. I mean, we say that 1 million new migrants net have come from the European Union since 2010, but the problem is there have been 2.3 million national insurance numbers issued. So I begin to worry as to what the real numbers are. Whatever mistakes we've made, anybody that came to Britain legally is here legally, and we would not attempt in any way to change that. Thereafter, yes, you're right, we would expect people to apply for work permits. We would expect people not to qualify for benefits until they've been in the country for up to 5 years, paid their taxes and obeyed the law, and we'd stop discriminating against people from India and New Zealand who've got real skills to bring us,
Okay.
who now find it very hard
Alan,
to get into
why
Britain.
are you... Alan, are you discriminating against people from the Commonwealth in favour of Europeans?
No, we're not. And incidentally, the only reason...
Of course we are.
Incidentally, the only reason why we haven't got a trade agreement with, between the EU and India is because Britain keeps blocking it. And they're blocking it because it would mean more migration from India. Anyone who thinks that the people on the right... just a second, Nigel. Anyone who thinks that the people on the right, like Nigel and his friends, want to come out of the European Union so they can let more Pakistanis and Indians come into the country are living in a fantasy land.
Okay, I want to bring in a question.
You know, Alan,
right, go on, Nigel.
you clearly know next to nothing about how trade deals work. Nowhere else, anywhere in the world, do trade deals involve the free movement of people only inside the European Union.
Nigel,
and you're selling a complete myth
do you
to these
accept
people.
that the trade deals that do not have freedom of movement do have many more restrictions and many more tariffs?
No. Free trade deals, nowhere
Name
else in the
one,
world.
which is
Nowhere
as good.
else in the world do free trade deals involve the free movement of people.
No, but
Nowhere.
can you name a free trade deal anywhere in the world which doesn't have freedom of movement but does have the same trade rights that the customs union of the EU?
Many free trade deals involve a total abolition.
Could you name one?
Most free trade deals. I mean, Switzerland
Well, they've
has
got freedom
more
of
free
movement.
trade deals than we do. And as I mentioned, Iceland has got a better deal with China than we've got. Trade deals are about sovereign states getting rid of barriers to trade. Never does it mean the free movement of people.
Nick.
I mean, Nigel,
Never.
Forgive me, you really are now just making stuff up. Iceland's deal with...
I'm sorry.
Iceland's deal...
I'm sorry.
Iceland's deal with China, with the greatest respect to any Icelanders in the audience, is a rubbish deal. They have been completely railroaded by the Chinese. We can measure up to the Chinese in negotiations with them precisely because we represent what remains the world's largest marketplace. Look, there is something called safety in numbers. There's something called strength in numbers. That's what you derive by doing stuff together rather than having this illusion that you can just wave a magic wand and tell the rest of the world to abide by our rules when we are just on our own. Isolation doesn't make you stronger. It simply doesn't in the modern world.
Well, it means it's more flexible.
Can I just address, if I may, Anusha, can I just address this underlying point that I think certainly was explicit in what Andrea said earlier and is certainly implicit in what a lot of Nigel says, which is that we always get a bad deal in the European Union. They tell us what to do. We never ever, however much we stamp our foot, we never get our way. I think if you're a political scientist from Mars and you landed in Europe and you asked yourself, what are the big things that have happened in Europe over the last 20 years or so, you'd probably single out two massive revolutionary changes. One, the creation of the single market. A British invention, first invented by a man called Lord Cockfield, who was then a little-known and, in my view, still an underappreciated British commissioner, and then enshrined in the Single European Act by a conservative government led by Margaret Thatcher at the time. That was the greatest sacrifice of sovereignty, but sensibly so because it created this borderless single market. The second huge transformation, which I remain of the view was one of the most brave things done by any generation of recent political leaders, was after the collapse of the Berlin Wall to extend a hand of friendship and partnership and embrace Central and Eastern Europe. That was a British achievement against the objections of other countries. Right. And you guys complain that we don't get our own way.
No, wait, Nigel, I'm going to bring in a question. I'm going to bring in a question from up above.
But you forgot to mention the euro, Nick. The euro. What a wonderful achievement the euro's been that you wanted us to join
but we're not
15 years ago. How about that? What a complete disaster that's been.
All right. I've complained about this always being a bunch of blokes fighting it out, so let's bring Andrea into this debate. Can I ask you a question? Some of the people who are campaigning for out disagree about the best way to go about this. There is Vote Leave and there's Leave.eu. Do you think Nigel's wrong to highlight immigration so much?
I'm absolutely only focused on what is right for our country. And in my view, being the 5th biggest economy in the world, having the opportunity to do our own trade deals, still being very much a part of Europe with friendly negotiations, working together where we want to, but being on our own, free to deal with the rest of the world. That's really what interests me. So I think anybody who's interested in putting those arguments to the British people are people who are doing a good thing. So I'm not really interested in the kind of shenanigans.
Okay, let me bring in David Sevier, who I think is up there.
Scotland has made it very clear that if Britain votes to leave the EU, it will seek to leave the United Kingdom so it can remain part of the EU. If the price of Britain leaving the EU is the dissolution of the United Kingdom, do you believe this is a price worth paying?
Okay. Nigel, why don't you start with that? And
Yeah.
thank you. And let me just throw into the mix Jeremy Clarkson's view of this, which is that if we leave, I always agree with Jeremy, if we leave the EU, he suggests immigrants will simply come through Scotland.
What complete and utter nonsense the Scottish debate is. The first thing to say is that as this campaign goes on, already we see a narrowing whereby the levels of those that want to leave in Scotland are becoming increasingly not dissimilar to the levels of those that want to leave in England. That's point number one. But if Britain does vote for independence, and that's what this referendum is all about, the idea that the Scots would vote, well, oddly against independence, but would vote for separation and would say to the Scottish people, we can stand on our own 2 feet, when they based all their economic numbers 2 years ago on oil at $113 a barrel, when it's now trading at $35 a barrel, is frankly for the birds.
All right, Alan.
It's all a load of nonsense, says Nigel. Well, I think it's highly likely that if Britain votes to leave Europe, then Scotland will vote to leave Britain. And we lose not just our place in Europe, we've not just damaged our continent, we've damaged ourselves and we've unravelled the Union. To be frank, if I was a Scot, and I'm for the Union, if I was a Scot and Scotland voted, and yes, it does depend on Scotland voting heavily to remain, and the rest of the country voting to leave, and I hope that doesn't happen, but if I was in Scotland, I'd be thinking again as well. And I think we are running a very, very high risk here, not just for our place in Europe, but for Britain's continued continuation as well.
You said you voted in 1975. As I understand it, Scotland then voted out. So what's changed in Scotland? When did they become such Brussels lovers?
What's changed in the Labour Party as well? The Labour Party was divided. Mrs. Thatcher, of course, the day when the result was announced, which was a huge 66% in favour, she said she was highly delighted. She went around with her flags of all the 9 European Union countries at the time. That was 75, incidentally, 9 member states, no World Trade Organization, and no Channel Tunnel. Now, a much more interdependent world, 28 member states, 41 years of membership we'd be wrenching ourselves away from, and Nigel and his colleagues seem to think there'll be so much goodwill in the rest of Europe that we'll get these brilliant trade deals that are just as good as the ones we've got now before we wrenched ourselves away.
You support the United Kingdom. Are you concerned about what might happen?
No, I'm not actually, because the truth is the Scottish Nationalist Party just had their referendum. They voted 55-45 to remain, and so it's simply not credible that they would choose to have another vote and that the UK government would allow them to do it. So take an example of a poll recently in the West Midlands. The West Midlands are 80%, according to polls, in favour of leaving. So what are we going to end up where little regions have their own say on what their view is of the EU? It's just a nonsense. They voted to remain in the UK at a time when they knew a referendum was on the cards.
Let's put that to Nick.
So
Nick, it's not credible that they're going to get another referendum.
Well,
not credible.
With respect, the SNP have said they want to move towards another referendum.
Always, that's
so
the point
if they,
of the SNP,
if they
Nick,
say it, I suggest we should believe what they say
for.
rather than what any of us say here. Look, I think it not only would clearly weakens our place in Europe. It clearly weakens the bonds that hold the United Kingdom together. I also think it would significantly weaken our standing in the rest of the world. I mean, if you look at the all-important relationship with our friends in the United States, I mean, that one of the reasons why the United States values the United Kingdom is precisely because not only we share language and culture and so on, but also because we can stand tall in our own European neck of the woods, which is important on our side of the Atlantic. If we suddenly are out of the European Union and the United Kingdom, worse still, has disintegrated, then of course we're going to be less relevant to the United States. And what I always find interesting about people who advocate Brexit, often, I'm not sure if that's the case for Nigel and Andrea, often they're the most ardent Atlanticists. But precisely leaving the European Union would be a bigger body blow against that great transatlantic relationship than almost anything else we could remotely do as a country.
No.
Well, okay.
No, I mean, we
Andrea?
in the UK, we're one of only 4 countries that are meeting the NATO requirement for 2%. The UK and the US do share a language. We share a great deal of history. It's just not plausible that we would lose any ability.
Why are the Americans then saying that
the Americans, Nick?
Yes.
A couple of Americans, yes.
Well,
there are other Americans who say
President Obama,
that the UK should leave the EU.
President Obama is a bit more than a couple.
He's an outgoing president.
It's not Joe Bloggs in Cleveland. This is the President of the United States.
And it is not, he doesn't have a vote. He, Nick, doesn't have a vote, does he? This is for the British people.
But he has a view
to
as
decide.
the US President that it is best
Of
for the
course.
transatlantic relationship.
Thank you very
and the
much.
United States
Do you want a quick one, Nigel? Quick.
Just to say that Obama is the most anti-British president America's ever had. And actually, Nick, the big bind between us and America is through NATO. Now, I'm not fully in favour of all the wars that America's talked us into, but I have to say that actually the biggest threat to the Anglo-American relationship, the biggest threat to NATO, is the fact that in Brussels they are hell-bent on building a European army, navy and air force as quickly as they can. And when I raised this 2 years ago with Mr. Clegg, he told me it was a dangerous fantasy. It is now being proclaimed by everybody in Brussels. They have established a separate command structure, and I think that NATO and our relationship with America is threatened by EU
All right.
The
military.
bigger danger is Putin. The bigger danger is Putin. The much bigger danger rather than this fantasy fear of a Euro army
says it every
is Vladimir
week,
Putin.
Okay.
What does Vladimir Putin want?
One sec.
Stop lying to people about this. You lied in 14 and you're lying again. They want a European army, and that's a fact.
All right,
Nigel,
thank you very
calm
much.
down.
I'm going to bring in Lee. Lee Sheldon in the audience, who's here.
Good evening. I've got to be honest, I'm one of those people who is still undecided, believe it or not. And I think one of the challenges is getting facts. So I like to just zoom in on a couple of facts if possible. One of the arguments that the Remain side make is that if we're outside the single market, we won't have any say on the rules that govern it. What examples, tangible examples, can you give me of how we've actually affected those rules, specifically about the single market? And perhaps if I could ask a question to the exit side, we all know, Nick said it, that if you are buying in bulk, you get a better deal. How can you assure me that we could do deals with China, India, whoever, with 60 million people and get a better deal than if we were supporting a deal of 500 million people?
Okay. Alan?
Well, I think, as Nick said, the creation of the single market is very important as a British ideal carried out by a Conservative government. It was always a single market in trade and should also be a single market in services. 80% of our trade is in services rather than goods. And we have been instrumental in pushing the Services Directive. And the Prime Minister's negotiations took that a little bit further, and I think that's a very big prize for us. The agreement that Andrea mentioned, of the trade agreement with Canada, doesn't include services. In all its 1,400 pages, half of which are exemptions to free trade. I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is about
plastic duck manufacturer, you still need to abide by the colorant directive if you are producing electrical appliances in Britain.
Why have we got different plugs, Nick?
What?
Why have we got different plugs then?
Well, that's a very good point, but it shows the flexibility, the joyous flexibility of the European Union, that they don't harmonise everything. No, but here's the point. If you do, for instance, what Norway's done, right? So they are outside the European Union, but they quite understandably want to export effortlessly into the single market. Guess what they call it? They call it fax democracy, because the rules that you allude to are faxed to them from Brussels once we've made those rules, and then they literally have to transpose them, no questions asked, into domestic legislation. So oddly enough, Norway, often held up as the great paragon of greater independence and taking control of their own affairs, have catastrophically lost control and real sovereignty over their own affairs because they're not at the table where those rules are being drafted.
Okay, there was another question. Andrea, Nigel. Andrea first.
Well, I'm just, in response to Nick, I just wonder how on earth the Chinese managed to buy a Jaguar Land Rover car.
No, but they
how
don't.
on earth, if the plugs don't match EU regulations and so on, are you seriously saying that the only advantage in trade in goods is if you've got some kind of EU rules
But the whole point that Alan was saying, that actually, I think it's about 70% of our GDP is made up of services.
Yes.
We have a massive surplus, so we sell much more of our services, those architects, those lawyers, those advertising execs.
No, we don't, Nick.
Yes, we do, to
no,
the rest of the
because
European...
there are barriers put up to the internal market in services.
Well,
yes,
I tell you,
are.
a lot less than to
Yes,
Chinese
no,
engineers or architects or advertising execs. The whole point is that the international trade agreements we have with China is tariffs on goods only. It doesn't cover the most important part of our economy.
So you'll
and we
agree,
shouldn't
then?
jeopardise services in the British economy, given how important they are.
Well, so you'll agree then that it's a shame that in 40 years the EU hasn't achieved a free trade agreement with China, no doubt. But just coming on to how big is the EU, how important is it? Back in the 1980s, it was 30% of global GDP. Now it's set to be around 17%. It's actually the third biggest regional bloc for trade, and the UK is the world's fifth biggest economy. So what you say about, we can't survive on our own, we can't do deals, we'll be meaningless, it's kind of like a prisoner sitting hunched up in their cell, and the jailer's just opened the door, and the prisoner's scared to go out. To say that we've got nothing to offer without being a part of this incredibly controlling, increasingly controlling bloc is just nonsense.
Okay, Nigel.
Yeah. Well, look, once again, Nick is telling you a complete pack of lies about Norway and their deal, but he's good at that. He's done it for a living for years. What I would say, I mean, we're being told, wouldn't it be dreadful to be like Norway? How ghastly. Can you imagine being rich and independent and happy? It's one of the most successful countries in the world, but we have to knock them and berate them. I think what we need to understand...
Okay.
We've got to get to a fundamental point here.
Why does the Norwegian Prime Minister say we shouldn't do it?
Career politicians who've never bought and sold a good or a service around the world in their lives are trying to tell you that it's governments through technical deals that make trade and business happen around the world. It is not. Trade is done by consumers looking at a product and trusting it and buying it. Okay. And actually, we're living in a modern global economy.
I'm bringing in a question.
The sooner we free ourselves to recognise that whilst trade with Europe is important,
thanks, Nigel.
Trade with the world and being free to make our own trade deals is even more important.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to bring in a question.
Can I just ask Nigel?
No.
Can I just ask Nigel,
No.
Why is it that the Norwegian Prime Minister, why is it the Norwegian government have said, Britain, you shouldn't follow our example? Why do you think that is?
Shall I tell you why that is, Nick?
Why is that?
Shall I tell you why that is? Because just like you, and just like
they're lying as well, are they?
in this country,
So the Norwegians
Norwegians who voted no to the European Union were betrayed by their own political class and signed up to the single market.
All a betrayal,
and it shows the danger of trusting people like you.
I'd like you to all stop. I thought, just before I bring in this question, you might like this comment from Kate McCann. Loving punchy Nick Clegg being back on the scene. #confession. All right, let's bring in question from Andrew Priest, but it's going to be read by our volunteer, Joe, because Andrew didn't show himself at the desk. Go for it, Joe.
Philip Hammond said in a speech, none of our allies want us to leave the EU. Not Australia, not New Zealand, not Canada, not the US. In fact, the only country, if the truth is told, that would like us to leave the EU is Russia. That should probably tell us all we need to know. My question is he right, and can we be more effective in opposing Putin outside the EU?
Alan.
No, we can't. Indeed, that's been one of Europe's great, I think, steps forward, that they were able to put meaningful sanctions against Russia over Crimea in particular. And I think that has demonstrated not just the European Union's commitment to freedom, democracy, free speech, which are very important principles. They've brought oligarchies to be democracies across our continent, and it's a contribution that we shouldn't forget. And I
Okay.
think the only politician that would be pleased, the only international politician who would be very pleased if Nigel and Andrea get their way is Vladimir Putin.
So, Nigel, you're critical of Barack Obama. Would you rather align yourself with Putin?
No, I don't want to align myself with anybody in the world. I want to be an independent country that governs itself, chooses its own foreign policy. And can I say there are lots of voices in business and through civic society right throughout the Commonwealth that would love Britain to be able to make trade deals with them, to cooperate more closely with them. The question about Putin, the question about threats, and how best do we deal with threats? Let me say this, and I'll say it again. The NATO alliance has proved a very effective means of governments to cooperate together to deal with providing deterrence against threats. What the European Union did by trying to say to the Ukrainians, we want to expand, we want you to become part of our union and you to become part of our military alliance, was to directly provoke the coup that got rid of an elected president of that country. And we have actually provoked this situation with Putin. I don't think that's very clever.
Nick.
I really don't.
Nick.
Well, it's the clean sweep now, isn't it, according to Nigel Farage? So President Obama's anti-British, the Norwegian politicians have betrayed their people, everyone else lies, and now the European Union is responsible for Russia barging into Crimea. Yeah. It's absurd.
Yeah,
it's complete. What is this sort of
absolutely.
hysterical conspiracy theory?
Absolutely. No, absolutely, Nick, you're right.
Andrea.
We provoked Putin
Talk about
in the
swinging
Ukraine
windmills,
unnecessarily
honestly,
Okay.
and stupidly.
Thanks, Andrea.
You know, I think this is a really serious point. It's very easy for other countries to say, oh, you should just stick with the EU, because, of course, that's the devil they know. They've got no skin in the game. This is a very serious issue for the UK's own voters. It's impossible for other people, I think you mentioned Australia, Canada in Philip Hammond's quote. I mean, how can they possibly know the problems that we have with the EU? The EU didn't used to be a problem. When it started out, it was great, exactly as Nick said. It set out free trade. It was a good thing to be in. Since then, we've had ever-increasing centralisation, bureaucracy, more political control. We've got the Schengen, we've got the Euro, and that is absolutely going in the wrong direction for the
But
UK's
Britain is
national
outside
interest.
Schengen, Andrea.
So it's really not for other allies.
But Britain is outside Schengen and the Euro.
Yes, oh, well, absolutely, but that's my point. The fact that we're outside those things means that as the European Union, who are inside, many of them are inside Euro and Schengen, they have to act in the interests of their common external border and their common currency. And that's where the real problem comes.
Okay.
The status quo in
Alan
the
wants to
UK
respond.
is simply not an option.
I just want to ask you a question, Andrea. If Europe is always something that's done to us and we're outvoted every time, and it's been a terrible disaster for us, how come we're the fifth largest economy in the world and very successful when we spent 41 years
Andrea?
having things done to us by the
Andrea.
European Union?
So the UK's economy has grown in line with the rest of the world. There hasn't been some massive dividend for being a member of the EU. So the British economy has grown because the British economy's own strength. So if you look at the charts over a very long period of time since we joined the EU,
It's nothing to do with
growth
Europe.
is in line
Our success is
with
nothing
other
to do with
world
Europe at all.
economies.
Nothing to do with Europe
so
at all.
are you going to say then that Greece's economic success is also due to their membership of the EU?
I'm
Great
gonna-
job.
No. I'm going to say that our trade with Europe has increased by a third to a half. And that's an important part of our
All
success.
right, I'd just like to tell you what Grant Stanley is saying here on Twitter. He thinks that, Andrea, you would make a very good Chancellor of the Exchequer, which has got me thinking about the Conservative Party. I think we might have to address that issue. And this is to all four of you. Nigel, there's a lot of blue-on-blue bashing going on here. Andrea herself has had to be critical of things the Prime Minister has said. Do you think their party can survive this?
Well, I enjoyed Angela being critical of the Prime Minister. It was really rather fun. I think the problem is that so many of the newspapers are framing this debate as a blue-on-blue debate, and that's probably a very big turn-off for two-thirds of the population who didn't vote blue in the general election. You know, to be a Eurosceptic is not to be right of centre. This question of whether we govern ourselves is not about left and right, as far as I'm concerned. It's about right or wrong. And I hope this referendum, I hope it doesn't degenerate into a civil war in the Conservative Party and a battle for the succession. I fear it is heading in that direction.
Well, Nigel is on my far left tonight, which is quite fun, but as he points out, you're far right. Alan, the point Nigel makes is very interesting. 2/3 of the population who didn't vote Tory, are they being put off this? And actually, what are you doing to get Labour voters out? Because there are a lot of concerns that Labour isn't doing enough.
Well, it has been blue on blue, and that's the one thing I agree with Nigel. I think it's tempting for you in the media, dare I say, to make a story when it's Boris speaking against Cameron
or
and Cameron
cabinet ministers speaking against their prime minister.
Yeah, I mean, that is the story. And it's been a story that's dominated the first 3 weeks. I don't think it'll dominate the whole campaign. And in terms of what we're doing, it's about getting out to Labour voters, talking to them on the doorstep and making the arguments, which might not get the media coverage, but is very important come 23rd of June.
All right. Andrea, I was asking about blue on blue. Tell me, how is this affecting your party?
So I just don't think there is blue on blue. I mean, you always get some members of the party who will disagree with the party leadership. But, you know, for my own part, I genuinely say the Prime Minister has done a brilliant thing in allowing and, in fact, encouraging members of the party, even if they're ministers, as I am, to go with their heart. And I had a lunch with him just before this all kicked off, where he literally said, do not be persuaded by anyone, not by me, not by your whip, not by your party, not by your constituents. Go with what your heart tells you. And that's very empowering. And for me, that is about the country would be better off outside of the European Union. So, I mean, obviously the media likes to sort of big up disagreements, but I think you'll find if you actually look at what people are saying, I have not criticised the Prime Minister and I don't criticise him. You might hear it that way, but it's absolutely clear that the party is doing this in the interest of what people genuinely believe is right for the country.
All right, and talking about Tory bashing, Nick, you've been at the receiving end of some of that. Are you enjoying what you're seeing?
No, I mean, look, it's obviously it's been brewing for ages. I mean, it's like the sort of two sides of the Conservative brain at war with each other, and it represents a very profound philosophical difference within the Conservative Party between those who kind of accept the modern world as it is, who believe that globalization requires an internationalist response, and those who hanker after a sort of 19th century view of parliamentary sovereignty, sort of gunboat diplomacy, and they're at war with each other. But I mean, look, there are not just divisions in the Conservative Party. Of course there are divisions. I mean, people feel very strongly about this. At the end of the day, people, I think, will vote with their hearts as much as with their heads. I think it's interesting that younger people tend to be much, much more positive about us remaining in the European Union. And I do think, by the way, if you're an uncle or a father or a mother or an aunt or a grandparent, I do think we all need to kind of pause and think what we decide will fall on their shoulders, on the youngsters' shoulders. And in a sense, we don't have a right to mess it up for them. We don't have a right to make a bad decision which messes it up for them.
Andrea?
Yeah. Can I just say, to coin a phrase, I agree with Nick. I think it's absolutely vital that we all look at this from the point of view of our children and our children's children. I mean, I'm a mum too. You sort of play the dad card quite a lot, Nick. I have 3 kids myself who all firmly believe that the UK's best days lie ahead of us, and they are all absolutely comfortable and excited about the prospect of the UK leaving the EU. So I don't want you to sort of claim the moral high ground for young people. What young people want is opportunities. Yeah. They want to travel the world. They want to have the chance.
Yes, absolutely.
They want
no,
they don't. They want to travel the world. No, the world.
Andrea, is
how many people take their gap year just in Europe, Nick?
All right, but
not
no,
many.
Andrea, just on that point, it is true, however, that if you look at the polls, young people are more likely to back in, older people are more likely to back out.
Yeah. I mean, you're saying that, Anushka. I think we'll find out on June the 23rd. But what I would say is young people are looking for opportunity and freedom. There's a very interesting interview done with a Polish lawyer recently who came to this country and said actually she'd like Britain to vote for Brexit. Why? Because Britain now reminds her of totalitarian Eastern Europe, when actually everything was moving towards greater centralisation, greater bureaucracy.
But Andrea,
And
Okay.
what we
Andrea,
need
Andrea,
is freedom
do you at least
to make
accept,
our own future.
Do you at least accept that this issue about the freedom to move around our hemisphere in Europe, it is a two-way street. There are almost as many Brits living, studying, working in Europe as there are Europeans coming here.
No,
And
all right, Ron.
On that point, Nick,
why would we deprive them of that freedom?
Nigel, what happens to Brits abroad?
Nick, can we please stop lying? Why do you do this? Why do you do this?
What happens to the Brits in Spain, Nigel?
There are 4 million. There are 4 million EU citizens living in this, including my wife, living in this country, and living full-time in the rest of Europe, excluding Ireland, fewer than 750,000. Can we please at least argue on the basis of the facts?
Those are wrong.
Please.
Those are wrong. You're wrong.
Please.
You're
Okay,
wrong.
before we carry on, Alan, do you think your leadership is doing enough? And can I just also throw in there, how do people feel voters might feel about the monarch's views being aired in such a public way?
Oh, well, you
Alan?
better ask Nick about that. He's been having some personal conversations. Yes, my leader's doing enough. There's a video out there now. He's absolutely committed to Britain remaining in the
That's
European
Jeremy,
Union.
not the Queen.
Yeah, but absolutely committed. It is true that there were many people in 75 who voted against who have changed their minds in the ensuing 41 years. That is true, and that may well include Jeremy. It also includes people like John Prescott and Doug Hoyle and many others. So that's not unusual, but we're committed to staying in. To us, there is no progressive argument for Britain leaving the European Union. There's no progressive argument about Greece. Greece don't even want to leave the Eurozone, never mind Europe. And how can it be progressive to leave the rest of Europe dealing with this so-called trade agreement with America, TTIP? We just walk away from it, leave it to them, and then we end up with a trade deal that's very heavily influenced by whatever comes out of it, except, of course, that the current government might put things in that the European Parliament and others managed to take out. So we'd have a
Nick,
worse agreement with America.
How did you feel about being at the heart of that media storm? Annoyed that someone leaked details of a conversation you'd had?
The whole thing is A-grade, 24-carat bilge. I mean, it's just... It's nonsense. It's not. It's just. I mean, honestly, the idea that I would deliver a sermon to Her Majesty the Queen, or still more improbably, that she would lower herself to have a bust up, as the Sun put it, with a mere sort of politician like me, it's just ludicrous. They'll no doubt, by the way, say that was a non-denial denial. Which is what they said when I last told them it was nonsense. It's just ridiculous. I think we shouldn't be dragging the Queen into it, and whoever peddled this silly false story to the Sun, who then gullibly gobbled it up, should stop trying to drag her into it. She doesn't want to be involved in it, and I think we should respect that.
Okay. Either of you want to comment on that before I bring in a question? No?
Well, I just want to note one thing, Alan. I'll tell you what's progressive about leaving the European Union. We will get away from having our laws made by people we can't vote for and remove, and return to being a democratic nation. And that is progressive. That is progressive. Yes. And it's something young people should embrace.
Okay, I'm going to bring in another question about the issue of youth, and I think our volunteer Paige is going to read it. It was from Finian Robinson. Paige.
As a 17-year-old who will live with the consequences of this crucial EU referendum far longer than those on the stage, I am outraged and offended that we, aged 16 and 17, will not be allowed to vote on this issue, which will have such a significant effect on our futures. How is this justifiable, and how will you each ensure that the concerns of young people are addressed in the in and out campaigns?
Where is she?
She's at the back there.
I see. Sorry.
But she's our volunteer. Andrea.
I see.
It's an interesting question. I'm actually very much on the fence about this. I think the only thing I draw from is I had a debate at one of my secondary schools a couple of years ago now, where they wanted to discuss as a youth parliament whether the age of voting should be lowered to 16. And there were about 140 of them there. We turned it into a parliament. We had a speaker, all that. In the end, they voted by something like 120 to about 7 that they shouldn't lower the voting age. And the reason they gave was because when you're 16, 17, you're still much too influenced by your immediate family around you, whereas once you reach 18, your views are more independent. I mean, that's the only thing I can offer to this, but I actually feel quite quite divided on the subject. And my children are 20, 17 and 12, so they're right in that zone. And certainly I think my own kids would certainly be up to voting.
Well, we tried to amend the legislation to get, I think, Lib Dems as well, to try to get 16 and 17-year-olds voting in this because it was a vote about the future, just like the referendum in Scotland last year. We failed. My worry is how, so, that argument's gone. How do we ensure that we get 18-year-olds and above voting when the voter registration system has missed so many off? So there's a big job to do in universities, in colleges, to get young people to register. And I think just going back to something that Nick said earlier, in Ireland they had this wonderful referendum on gay marriage, which in a socially conservative country had an amazing 2-to-1 to vote in favour. And they had an issue there. They had a different demographic. Younger people felt that gay marriage was right. Older people felt it was wrong. And they had this thing, Tell Your Granny, where young people went and convinced the older generation why it was important to them. So I actually think there's a better, I'm not suggesting this, but there's a better argument for 60, 70-year-olds not having the vote and 16 and 17-year-olds getting it.
Okay, Nick?
I've not much to add because I've always been an advocate of lowering the voting age. And I think anyone who was concerned that it didn't work or was inappropriate or whatever, just look at the commitment of those 16 and 17-year-olds who got really stuck into the debate in Scotland. I actually think it enriched that referendum debate. I don't think it weakened it. And I don't buy this idea that you're kind of, you didn't say infantile, but you're sort of too dependent on other people's views when you're 16 or 17, and then suddenly sort of chrysalis-like you emerge 18 with your mind completely made up. It's not the way I sort of grew up, and I just think I know lots of 50-year-olds who still can't make up their minds, and lots of 14-year-olds who know their own mind very well.
Well, I've always taken the view that to be a candidate, to vote in an election, you should be able to be a candidate in an election, and we will, after this referendum, have a proper debate about whether 16 and 17-year-olds get the vote. They won't this time round. But an interesting observation, whether it's Greece, whether it's Spain, whether it's France, whether it's Italy, right across the continent, on the centre, right and left, the new Eurosceptic tide is utterly dominated by the under-30s. I don't think we're quite there yet in this country, but it's an interesting observation. The rebellion against Brussels is coming from the young.
Okay, can I ask a question starting with you, Nigel? We're seeing some pretty terrible scenes at the moment with the refugee crisis that's taking place in Greece and in other countries at the edge of Europe, even in Calais. People would say that the pictures we're seeing, this is a story which is really something very, very human. And really, these are asylum seekers rather than economic migrants. Are you scaremongering about the refugee crisis?
Well, look, I mean, when the boss of, Nick quoted the boss of Europol, earlier on in this debate, the boss of Europol said 2 weeks ago there are now 3,000 to 5,000 jihadi terrorists, in his view, on mainland Europe who've used the migrant routes to get into Europe. And that is the problem that there are. Yes, there is a huge tide of human misery. I understand that. But the problem that we've got is we have absolutely no means of defining who a genuine refugee is. We cannot continue, or Europe cannot continue, with its current policy. It has led to scenes such as that we saw in Cologne, some of the things that are happening now socially in Sweden that are wholly unacceptable. To have a proper refugee policy, the EU will need to have offshore processing centres where they can define who is genuinely a refugee as opposed to somebody just displaced by war. Because if you believe the UN, there are currently 59 million people displaced by war. What Angela Merkel did last year to say, as many of you that want to come, we can cope, was, I think, one of the biggest policy areas of modern politics.
Andrea, do you agree with Nigel? And also, there's an amendment in the Lords at the moment calling for Britain to take 3,000 unaccompanied children from Calais. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it's absolutely devastating. And I think on the ground, I think people are doing amazing work just to try and look after, whether they are refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, they're still human beings and they absolutely do need help. And I'm glad to see that Europe is now actually starting to pick that up. I mean, obviously, I do agree with Nigel that Angela Merkel's decision to say, well, come along in, was devastating because what it did was encourage people to make what is a perilous journey. It also encouraged human traffickers and all of the perils of that, which has just exacerbated the problem.
But
so
what
I
about
think
unaccompanied children?
Sorry?
What about unaccompanied children?
So
That's a different issue.
on that very specific point, David Cameron has been very clear that there's a very careful consideration here between whether you simply take those children from everything they're familiar with and bring them to the UK where they don't have the language, they don't have any family and so on. And he's taking advice from some of the children's charities on what is the best thing to do. So obviously, if you have a child who's orphaned and there is extended family around, it's better if you can keep them with their extended family. So I think the Prime Minister has been very clear that he's looking very carefully at what is the best thing to do for those children. And I'm absolutely certain that if the best thing is to bring them to this country, then he will.
Okay, Nick?
No, I'm hugely embarrassed by the very meagre response of this government to the unaccompanied children. There is simply no earthly reason why we couldn't respond to the target that Save the Children and other campaigners have set to take in these, lonely, traumatized children who are not the gun-toting terrorists that Nigel talked about. These are children, unaccompanied children.
What does any of this mean for the EU debate?
Can I just on the EU debate, exactly. What I think is so deeply disingenuous about the way in which Nigel and others try to use people's legitimate unease and fear and disquiet about what they see on their television screens, about these millions of wretched, frightened people risking their lives coming into Europe and somehow claiming that if we leave the European Union, all will be well, is that it is based on a totally false assumption that if we leave the European Union, people won't continue to flee war and attrition and hunger and poverty and persecution and try and come to the United Kingdom. Whether we're in the European Union or not, of course people will flee huge distances to try and come here. And it is so dishonest to somehow claim that if we were to leave the European Union, somehow that problem would go away. It's deeply dishonest.
Alan,
Can I come back in?
After Alan.
I think we should be playing our role in Europe. Now, we're in the almost perfect position of being outside Schengen, but part of the Dublin Accord. So every year, about 1,000 asylum seekers who come to this country are returned because they're economic migrants and not asylum seekers. If we leave the European Union, we lose that. And, I repeat, it is inconceivable that there will be sufficient goodwill in France. The mayor of Calais comes to Parliament once every 3 months and says, ironically, Nigel's catchphrase, take back your border. They want us to take back the British border from Calais back to Dover. That would mean we'd be in a worse situation. What we should be doing is playing our part in resolving what is the biggest problem that refugee crisis that Europe has faced. And it's our problem as well. And it's the United Nations problem. Let's pull out of the UN if we want to blame somebody for all of this. Or let's work together with the UN and with Europe to solve this problem and play our part by taking those unaccompanied children who have families in this country and who are desperate in terms of their need for family life.
You've talked about the border at Calais.
Currently about 90, as I understand it.
Can I just ask you quickly, you've just talked about that border at Calais, and obviously President Hollande has warned that that might be pushed back if we were to leave the EU. Why would France rip up a treaty between the two of us that has nothing to do with the EU?
Well, it has a lot to do with the EU, actually. It has everything to do with the EU. Yes, it does, Nigel. The fact that we are both European Union countries was listen to David Blunkett, who negotiated the agreement with Nicolas Sarkozy when he was the Interior Minister of France. It was because we were members of the European Union that deal was done. It's a very unpopular deal for politicians in France. They've got a presidential election coming up. Britain wrenches itself away after 41 years of membership. Do you honestly believe there's going to be sufficient goodwill there to keep that agreement?
Yes.
Which basically is
Andrea?
UK border force,
it works
not
for
in
France
Dover,
as
but
well
in
as the-
Calais.
But if we have a
Yeah.
border force in Dover, Alan, we can say to people, no, you can't come in. That's what border controls are. This scare story. This
Yes,
scare
scare
story
story.
that once
Yeah.
they got into Britain, they set up a camp in Folkestone. Oh, no, they wouldn't. They'd disperse across the United Kingdom
that's all right, then.
before you could say Jack Robinson. It's a
Andrea?
ridiculous scare story.
It is.
Andrea?
Yeah, no, well, I agree with Nigel. It's just a scare story. I mean, that agreement has nothing to do with the EU. And actually, interestingly, when François Hollande decided to tentatively suggest it might be torn up, the Interior Minister absolutely didn't. And so I think you have to be very careful here that you're not just peddling something that's just
I'm repeating
absolute
what your Prime
nonsense.
Minister said, the leader of your party, who said that if we leave the European Union, it's highly likely that France will say, take back your border. I agree with him.
All right, listen, what we're going to do, because we're about to run out of time, I'm going to give you a little bit of what's been going on Twitter after this. But before we do this, I'm just going to give you all 30 seconds each, just one last chance to try and convince them. All right, Nick, off you go.
I just think in this uncertain, footloose, fancy-free world, we are stronger together. We are stronger together. I think we make ourselves safer, and I think we create and safeguard jobs for the future as well. So if we want to be a stronger nation in an uncertain world, I think it's important that we stick together with our European partners.
All right, Alan?
I'm
Actually, hold that thought. Nigel?
Well, we've heard tonight from Nick the audition to be the United Kingdom's next commissioner in Brussels. And indeed, through this campaign, we will hear Goldman Sachs and Nick Clegg and big businesses telling us it's vital to be part of this union for economic reasons. It isn't. We live in a modern global economy, and the sensible, rational thing for us to do is to take back control of our lives, take back control of our borders, and re-engage with the rest of the world as a happy, self-confident nation that can do a damn sight better making its own rules.
Alan?
I think in an even more interdependent world than it was in 1975, for us to rip up excellent trade agreements and then spend years trying to renegotiate them, for us to leave the protection of being part of Dublin but outside Schengen, and then try to get some kind of control of our borders that Nigel thinks we can do, even though the experience of other countries is they have to accept free movement, and to tear up the European arrest warrant, which has been the single biggest assistance to our police and security forces, because you can only have that if you're in the European Union. That would be fantasy land.
Good point. Andrea, thank you.
Okay, well, very briefly, I think the Remain side are all about Project Fear, and the Leave side is about Project Hope and about giving us the chance in a big world to be a big player, not a small player.
Okay, here's just a few comments from Twitter. Quite a lot of them seem to involve Nick Clegg. Look, I just really like Nick Clegg. This EU debate is quite punchy. I have to say, Nick Clegg is at his best. I'll tell you the only thing that is deeply, deeply dishonest. Clegg, you. All right, they're all about Nick Clegg. There's some support for the rest of them here too, but I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap up. How are you feeling about this? Another 100 days of this? Up for it? Let's see a quick show of hands. Has anybody been persuaded by what they've seen tonight to change their minds? There are a few people in here. It's all been worth it. And I have to say, it fits in the Palladium. Great theatre. I can imagine that they might make a play in the future about this EU referendum. I just want to know who's going to be playing Boris. I'd like to thank you all for coming here tonight, but most of all, please, a huge round of applause for our panellists.
Well done.
Well done.
Well done.
Thanks. Well done.
Well done, Nigel.
Okay.
All right, wasn't it?
All right.